You're listening to a Hebrew in Israel podcast with Yoel Halevi, exploring the language, culture, and history of the Bible. For more information, visit us at HebrewInIsrael.net.
Shalom everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Hebrew in Israel Haftarah series. I'm your host, Yoel Halevi, for HebrewInIsrael.net, and we are now starting to read a grouping of Haftarot that are all connected in some way or another to the temple. And there's a considerable problem when discussing these type of chapters. And the problem results from the fact that some of these readings, especially if we're talking about the one for this Haftarah Terumah, the next one Tetzaveh, and Vayakhel Pkudei, I skipped over Kitisa. Kitisa is a different subject, but we actually have 4 readings which are all connected to descriptions that have to do with the temple. And it's very difficult to discuss these things because they stem from a very, I would say, analytical and precise description of structures. And because we don't have a full understanding of the architecture that was used in this description, there are terms, there are concepts, there's a lot of stuff that goes into this material that makes it very, very difficult for us as commentators on this material to actually explain what's being described. And this is why I personally am very, very concerned going into this Haftarah because of what it actually represents. It's a very, very difficult thing to deal with. But I will try, and I will start with something very, very, very specific, which has to do with the subject of temples and overall. Now, I have done some discussions in the past in regards to what things may mean in some descriptions. I have done private classes. For example, I have my Bible class, which people, by the way, have emailed me about, and I do try to respond as fast as I can, though sometimes, unfortunately, I can miss people's emails. I am doing a lot of the stuff by myself, so it is a little tricky sometimes. But it is very, very important to understand that a lot of the functions of Hebrew in Israel are done basically just by myself. So if you're sitting and waiting there for a response from me, it will arrive. It's just sometimes I get very, very, very busy with other things, and it's not that I'm ignoring your email. It's just I specifically haven't reached your email yet. But, however, going back into the subject, I have done classes and have explained about temples before. You can listen to the Torah readings that I did about the mishkan, where I go into details about the mishkan and so on. And what we're dealing with here is the temple itself. Now, there is a question that hovers around in the material about the temple, which asks, why even build a temple? We understand that God commanded Moshe in the desert to build a temple. That we know, that we understand, that we see. However, when we approach the question of why even go ahead and decide to build a temple on a much, much larger scale that requires a specific location that's fixed. You're always going to be using this specific location. And requiring a construction that moves away from the description of the tabernacle, we have to ask the question of why. Why is this even happening? Why is this even being done? And I think that's a question that's that I think was very, very highly debated during the first temple and overall. Because up to that point, there was a tabernacle. God moved from place to place. With the tabernacle, the ark was considered to be the footstool of God. This is how you know God is with you. And God was perfectly fine for hundreds of years with simple structures, a tent. Maybe in Shiloh, the assumption is that in Shiloh there was a large building made out of stone with a yard around it and so on. But it wasn't really yet a full-blown building. And then suddenly, King Solomon decides to build a gigantic building. Now, it is important, by the way, to point out that in the book of Samuel, if we go back to the book of Samuel for a moment, and in 2 Samuel chapter 7, King David is sitting there going, well, I'm interested in building a temple. I want to do something here, and I want to go ahead and build temples. So he speaks to Natan, and Natan says to him, "Go ahead, and the Lord is with you." But then Natan receives a prophecy, and in the prophecy, God actually tells him, "No, I'm not interested, and I don't want this." The overall message is, I'm not interested. There's a lot of discussion over in the academic world. There's a lot of discussion about the editing of the text. However, in overall, the message here seems to be a lot about, I've never really asked for a temple. He actually says in verse 11, 2 Samuel, chapter 7, verse 11, "Ulemin hayom asher tziviti shoftim el ami Yisrael," from the day that I commanded judges on my people Israel, "V'anichoti lecha mikol ovecha," and I gave you peace from all your enemies. V'shachavta, v'higid lecha Adonai ki vayit yaseh lecha Adonai. And the Lord said to you, a house I will make for you. Okay? So if we actually go into 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 7, he actually says to him the following, "B'chol asher italachti b'chol b'nei Yisrael," in all which I have walked with all the children of Israel, it should be hadavo, but hadavar dibarti, et achad shivtei Yisrael, have I actually spoken with one of the tribes of Israel, asher tziviti lirot et ami et Yisrael lemor, which I commanded to shepherd my people Israel. The word et is duplicated here. Et ami et Israel. It's a clarification. My people. Who is my people? Israel. Lemor, saying, Lama lo v'nitem li beit arazim. Why haven't you built me a house of cedar? Now it's interesting. He's not talking about a house of stone. He's talking about a house of cedar. But that relates to the whole idea that the interior of the structure was usually paneled with wood. Now, later on, he connects the whole idea of houses, which is verse 11. It says, "Uminayom asher tziviti shoftim al ami Yisrael." So it repeats some of the elements that we see in verse 7. And from the day which I commanded judges on my people Israel, "V'anichoti lecha mikol ovecha," and I gave you peace from all your enemies. "V'higid lecha Adonai ki vayit yaseh lecha Adonai." And the Lord has said to you, "For the Lord will build you a house." So he's connecting the principle of the temple with some of the language with the principle of the kingship. And this is actually key to what we want to discuss here today. And he says to him, verse 12, "Ki mal'u yamecha," when your days are completed, "v'shachavta et avotecha," and you lay with your ancestors, "v'akimoti et zaracha achecha," and it will uplift your seed after you, "asher yetzeh mimecha," which will come up from your stomach, from basically the reproductive organs. V'achinotit mamlachto, and I will establish. Now, chinoti here is from the word kana, or kan, which is to establish. I will establish his kingdom. Hu yivne bayit lishmi, he will build a house to my name. V'chonantik et kiseh mamlachto ad olam, and I will establish his throne of his kingship. And mamlachto here is a very, very suspect word, by the way. Mamlacha is a bit of a late word, by the way, And it has meaning, because some argue that this is an insert from latter Hebrew, which might indicate that someone added this verse, but that's a whole discussion by itself. Ad olam, for all eternity, and the problem with ad olam is that obviously ad olam indicates the idea that the writer is unaware of the exile and is unaware of the destruction of the temple, and therefore mamlachto might not necessarily be, as for example some scholars have argued, might not necessarily be an insert of late information, but maybe someone using a different word later on. Instead of saying malchuto, mamlachto. You can argue about some of these things, because this is a very, very common thing that commentators, especially modern commentators, actually try to argue a lot, where they try to say, look, we find this word and therefore we can argue this, argue that. But you can also argue if it's an individual word, you can argue maybe someone has just replaced one word with the other. And he says to him, Ani ehielo le'av, this is verse 14, I will be a father to him, v'hu yeli leven, and he will be my son, asher beha'avoto v'ochachtiv b'shevet anashim. When he corrupts, when he twists, I will punish him, okay, or I will scourge him. Different possible words here. B'shevet anashim, with the shevet is usually a rod, the rod of people, basically what God can punish a human being with. Uvenig'ei b'nei adam, with the afflictions of mankind. However, v'chasdi lo yasur mimeno, but my covenant, because chesed here actually relates to the idea of covenant. A lot of people translate it as mercy or favor, but chesed here really relates to the principle of covenant. Will not be removed from him. Kasher asiroti me'im Shaul, as I have removed from Saul. This is a bit of a poking at Saul. Saul never really achieved anything really big in Israel. Asher asiroti me'lefanecha, which I removed before you. God is pointing out, remember, you're here because I decided that you're going to be here. Now, how does this all really wrap into why build a temple? Because we have a mishkan, we have a tabernacle. And remember, I had a conversation several years ago with a Samaritan, and I asked him what is their ideology in regards to the temple. They developed also some kind of messianic ideas and so on, even though they don't really have a Bible. They only have the 5 books of Moses and something apparently that resembles the book of Joshua to some degree. And they actually argue that there was never actually a temple in Mount Gerizim, or some of them at least have argued before me that there was never a temple in Mount Gerizim. There's no point in looking for it. There was only always a tabernacle. Why? Because they're trying to avoid the obvious issue of building something which is not prescribed in the Torah. But we know as fact that the Samaritans did build a temple of some size on Mount Gerizim, and there's an entire area, and I think it was Avigad might have dug there or something. There's the specific archaeologist who dealt with Mount Gerizim, who looked for the temple, the Samaritan temple, and actually found some basis and so on, and he produced some kind of reproduction of what he thinks it looked like. But there's a very obvious glaring question, because what Solomon is actually doing here is a little bit outside of the Torah. Natan didn't see any problem with the idea of King David wanting this. King David never saw a problem with this. We actually never really hear a conviction against the basic principle of having such a temple. It's only comes with a warning when you corrupt the temple, when you don't behave in the temple properly, when you don't treat the worship of God in his temple properly, then the temple becomes a nothing. And that's really the biggest issue. We need to understand that going ahead and building a temple is great. It's a wonderful thing, but it has to come with the right intent. And the right intent is that it's there as a physical place for mankind to stand before God and say, here we are, we submit before you, we want to do your will. Just having a building doesn't really make you anything, because you can literally corrupt anything, and that's part of what Ezekiel talks about quite a bit. But even Ezekiel, Yechezkel, which we will read later on, receives a prophecy about building a temple as well. So what is the purpose of building a temple? Why does suddenly King Solomon go ahead and build a temple? And it belongs to what we call royal ideology. Royal ideology, and there is the principle that a king is expected to do multiple things. And what's very interesting is that these multiple things that we find are continuously mentioned even inside Judaism. Judaism, for example, they say, how do you know who's the true Messiah? Who's the Mashiach? He has to fight the wars of God, bring back the scattered of Israel, and build the temple. That's almost to a T what's expected from a king in the ancient Near East. And we have a lot of examples like this. There are kings who did different reforms in their temples to try and make themselves look better before their God. There are many royal, hundreds, but there are quite a few royal inscriptions that talk about rebuilding a temple, renovating a temple. In Egypt, kings kept on adding to temples. There's, for example, a temple, I think, in Karnak, that was for the god Amun, and they added more and more and more and more. For hundreds of years, they kept on adding to the structure because each king wanted to put his stamp on this idea that, look, I'm serving the gods properly. Now, this is not 100% comparable to what the Bible is describing, but it does still follow the idea of royal ideology. And what does royal ideology describe the king as? He is described as a man who takes care of his people. He is described as a man who puts justice in the world. He is described as a man who's a builder. He is the representative of the gods on earth. And usually, by being the representative of the gods on earth, goes together with building structures. They tend to build temples, or at least renovate temples. And the idea here is that King Solomon is supposed to somehow complete a principle. God brought Israel out of Egypt, brought them into the desert, gave them the Torah. Eventually they arrived in the land, they received the land, and the pinnacle of everything, the point of everything, is the construction of a temple that God now has an established throne on earth. And this is why it takes an establishment. This is why King Solomon's throne is always established. He's always at peace. Not always, but there's this idea of him being established. His father receives peace from the enemies around him, and so on. And then suddenly there's the possibility of building a temple, because all the necessary parts for a king to be able to step forward and actually do the royal ideology requires him to have the ability to do such a thing, where his mind is not distracted into other subjects like war and having to take care of finances and so on. So this description here of King Solomon is very, very idealistic, but we get the criticism later on, by the way. It's very important to remember that the Bible doesn't cut back on criticism. When criticism is necessary, we get it. And it's sometimes even very harsh, because this is the warning that King David receives in 2 Samuel chapter 7. He says, I will be with him and he will be my son. This is an adoption type of language, which was very, very common in the ancient Near East. Is probably the background of Psalm 2 as well. It's an adoption principle. And kings were perceived as being because they are supposed to be the representative of the God, of whatever God they follow. They're supposed to be the representative of their God on earth as receiving the mantle of kingship. They are supposed to be adopted by this God, or even sometimes, for example, if you were an Egyptian, even be a reincarnation of one of these gods. Now, the king being a representative of the God on earth, or of God, the God of Israel on the earth, also becomes a type of Adam. And this is a really important thing as well. As a type of Adam, he is supposed to tend to the garden. He's supposed to tend to the world that God gave us. Adam was placed in the garden to la'ovda u'leshomra, to work in it and to preserve it. And what's very interesting is that the temples, and overall, there's quite a few research papers that I've seen, and even books about this, that deal with the question of temples as a representation of the Garden of Eden. And this is why water is very central in the temple. We have this in Ezekiel, for example, who describes a stream of water that comes out. But what's even more interesting is that King Solomon puts a lot of equipment that's supposed to contain water. And there are what's called the 10 machines. They're like these wagon things that carry around these basins of water. And there's a gigantic basin of water that sits on top of 12 oxen. And we're not going to go into the question of how come he's actually making images of oxes inside the temple. But at the end of the day, there's a large emphasis on water. And even today, the debate carries on about water in the temple, where the water come from. People try and describe the location of the temple and Temple Mount in other places because of different things that exist. But there actually is quite a bit of water underneath. There are these cisterns with water in them, which are used to this very day. Actually, if you go to Temple Mount, you can pull water out of there. And the temple, to some degree, is supposed to represent the Garden of Eden. So the king is a type of Adam, and he's supposed to build a temple that's supposed to be the connection place between man and God, that finally we reattach our reality and God's reality in a reproduction of the Garden of Eden through the temple. And this is why the temple has inside of it images of cherubs, and you have images of flowers and palm trees and so on. And in Ezekiel, we have water flowing from the temple. Water brings life. We have in Solomon's temple a lot of water mechanisms around the temple. And this is all very, very central to the idea that the king is supposed to reestablish the principle of Adam returning, or mankind returning to God, and returning to a type of state of the Garden of Eden. Even though it's not really the Garden of Eden, it's supposed to bring us back to some degree into that state. So the royal ideology, if we look at it from the perspective of Israel, is connected to Genesis. It's connected to Genesis 1, 2, 3. Okay, and the will to return to God, and the will to return to his God and to be in his presence. We have the Psalms that talk about wanting to be near God and walking in God's courtyards with fear, or with regesh, and Bet Elohim elech beragesh. You walk around the house of God with a lot of piety and a lot of internal. I'm not sure exactly how to translate the word regesh, because the word regesh is a very general word for a lot of different emotions, but the principle there is to indicate the idea that the person is walking around with a certain reverence to the place. Now, the description that we have in our chapter, and I'm going to very say from the beginning, this is not going to be a very, very long recording, because we're going to be dealing here with questions of architecture, which I'm going to openly admit we don't know. I actually sat, this is very recent, it's kind of interesting that literally, because I pre-record these recordings, I actually sat in a classroom and we were specifically talking about this chapter, and we happened to have an architect sitting as a free listener, as a person auditing the class, and he's an architect and he's reading these verses and he's trying to give us an idea of what we're talking about. And there are a lot of interpretations of what these things are, and a lot of drawings that you can find and so on. But at the end of the day, we don't know exactly what the temple looked like. There are some basic principles that we can go by, but other than that, we can't really say anything. So, there are a few things. It's quite commonly understood that the Temple of King Solomon was a temple on a straight axis, which means you go from one chamber to the other inside your temple. It's called a straight axis versus a 90-degree axis, which is usually you go in, and to go into the Holy of Holies, you have to take a right or a left. Here you go straight in. And that's a very basic model of what's called a Syrian temple. And these are usually temples with a portico and an entrance hall and a holy of holies, or a dvir, or a kodesh kodashim, and the kodesh, and the entire structure is called a heichal. Heichal is actually a word that's taken from Sumerian, got into Akkadian, and ended up in Hebrew as well. It basically means a large house, but we use it to describe temples as well in earlier language of biblical Hebrew. And the vessels inside the temple are supposed to represent the idea of like light and food and incense, but the ark is really the pinnacle of everything. However, other than that, everything else is speculation. We look at this, we look at the description we have here, and we can only assume a lot of things. There are constructions that I've seen where everything looks like as if everything is covered with stone. Some people argue the stone, for example, Holovitz, I think Avigdor Holovitz argued that all the stone of the temple was unhewn because they were trying to do something that's supposed to moving the laws of the altar to the rest of the temple. So we're talking about an unhewn stone temple. Some people say the entire thing was covered with stone. Some people think that the parts of the exterior were actually covered with wood. Very complicated stuff. We don't know every single detail here. So I can't promise anything in what we're going to be reading here. We're only going to try to understand. But what's very, very important, and this is really probably one of the most important things that we have here. This type of material is what we call archive material. It's a very, very detailed description that may or may have not been pulled out of an archive. And the archive is detailing what the temple looked like. Now, there's a big question because we know that in the ancient world, kings used to make inscriptions. But we don't have inscriptions from kings of Israel and Judah. We don't have almost anything except for maybe an inscription from King Hezekiah in Siluan. So, why is this? So, for example, Nadav Naaman wanted to argue that maybe there were some inscriptions and they were all destroyed. It's possible. For example, I did a research on King Achaz, and there's a section there that talks about the altar King Achaz built, and Nadav Naaman, which I used in trying to discuss this few verses, tries to say this might be some kind of an old inscription that was placed on a tablet next to that altar describing what happened, and someone came down and copied it. However, it's quite possible that maybe Hofmeier's theory, which he presents in a book that he wrote about the Exodus, that the kings of Israel, kings of Judah, Israel, did not write inscriptions because their practice was to write down records of things. And none of these records survived. They probably were exiled with the library during the times of King Yehoiachin or something like that, or maybe some of it was just lost throughout time. But the king's deeds were recorded. We have it in the Book of Kings. It says multiple times. The rest of the deeds of this king are written in this such and such book. So the kings of Israel kept a record of what they did, but they didn't write monumental inscriptions, which might indicate some of the mentality of the kings of Israel. When I say Israel, I also include Judah, that they avoided, that they didn't do such work, they didn't do such monumental inscriptions because they were a lot more pious. Even the wicked kings still had a certain piousness to them, which is a bit of an oxymoron, but that might be the fact. Now, we're going to be reading here, and again, this is going to go very, very, very fast because we don't really have a lot of details in explaining what we actually have in front of us. So we're going to start from 1 Kings chapter 5, verse 26, all the way to 6:13, which ends with a message of, I will not abandon Israel. I will point out that for example, in other years, for example, I'm recording this in the year where the rabbinic calendar has a 13th month, and therefore we read Terumah separately, Tetzaveh separately, so there are more readings. But in other years, some of these parashot are squeezed together, so we get one haftarah out of them. So this actually works really, really well. In other years, when I republish these recordings, there'll just be more recordings to publish during that week. But in any case, chapter 5, verse 26, it says, Va'adonai natan chokhmah li Shlomo. The Lord gave wisdom to Solomon, because the wisdom of Solomon is a very, very central theme, basically from around the end of chapter 2, chapter 3. Solomon asks for wisdom, and we have a very, very idyllic description of him. I said chapter 2. What I meant was from chapter 3 onwards. King Solomon's wisdom is a very, very central thing. And this verse kind of sends us back into that piece of information, because to construct the building, King Solomon was probably very heavily involved in the planning of the building. We find, for example, that royal princes or even kings were considered to be the great architect and so on. So King Solomon is presented here in a very, very idyllic way. He has wisdom, and therefore he has the ability to be an architect as well. So, and the Lord gave Solomon wisdom, kasher diber lo, as he spoke to him, as the Lord spoke to him. Vaish, and now we get the actual beginning of the chapter. This is an insert to kind of bring us into a certain way of thinking. And now it actually starts the section. Vayhi shalom ben Hiram uven Shlomo v'echretu vrid shnehem. And there was peace between Hiram, basically the king of Tyre, and between Solomon, and they cut a covenant between the two of them. Why? Because you need the people from Lebanon. Why? Because they have cedar. Everyone was looking for the cedar of Lebanon. Lebanon was a big exporter of cedar. Unfortunately, right now, the situation of the cedars of Lebanon is not good. And there's a fear that the next couple of decades, those cedars will be gone. And because there's some disease attacking some of the trees. I read this article about 6 months ago about this situation, and it's very sad, because Lebanon actually has really, really beautiful forests because of these cedars. So now we get a description of what King Solomon did, and we get a description of how he actually managed the kingdom to be able to also build this temple. It says, verse 27, Vayal HaMelech Shlomo mas mikol Yisrael, and King Solomon brought up a tax. Now the term mas here, which is translated tax, mas at this stage is what's known as mas oved. This is a workers' taxation, which means you actually have to put physical hours into labor. So this is what we call a tax worker. Basically, a person stands upon them, that's the taskmaster, and he's supposed to make sure that they work, and the taxation that people paid wasn't monetary, was actually physical labor. So from all of Israel, Vayhi amash 30,000 ish, and the taxation was 30,000 men. Vaishlachem Levanon, he sent them up to Lebanon. 10,000 b'chodesh chalifot, 10,000 a month with rotation. Chodesh yu b'Levanon, because you have to divide up your year into several segments, so there are 30,000 people. So these 30,000 people go up every 3 months. They go up for 1 month. So there are basically 4 rotations. So you have 10,000, 10,000, 10,000, and then the first 10,000 go back in. So there are 4 rotations. And it says, Chodesh yu b'Levanon, 2 chodeshim beveito. So 1 month they'll be in Lebanon, 2 months each person is in his own home. There's actually a variation here, because beveito is singular, but the first part is yihiyu, so Balevanon should be equated with the idea of bait, not beito. But there are two variations here. One just means home, and the other one means to his home. And I actually would prefer the word just home, because it's more equatable with the term Levanon. It says Adoniram alamas. This is again another glossary we have here. Adoniram is on the tax. Vayile Shlomo 70,000 noses sabal. So King Solomon had 70,000 carriers of sabalut. Sabalut is basically carry upon your shoulder. U80,000 chotzev bahar, and 80,000 men who are working through the mountain, basically in the quarry. Now, this is a really good question. It doesn't say he didn't take 30,000 men, so how something that we have 70,000, 80,000. This is actually a pretty common feature with Solomon. We got these massive numbers. We get a number that may or may, 30,000, which is fine, but then suddenly we jump into some massive numbers, like the whole idea of he had 300 wives, 700 concubines, or the other way around, I don't remember right now, sorry. But we get these massive numbers, these huge quantities with him all the time. It says, Levad misareh hanitzavim lishlomo. Besides the ministers of the nitzavim. Nitzavim is basically the district, probably the district rulers, who were to Solomon, asher al hamelacha, which are upon the task. 3,300, harodim ba'am, which are, redia is actually a very negative thing. It's actually to be a taskmaster. It's to really beat people when they don't do the work. Ha'osim ba'melacha, we're doing in the work. We're doing in the labor. Vayitzav ha'melech vayasiru avanim gedolot, and the King Solomon, the king commanded, and they carried great stones. We're talking about big blocks of stone. Avanim yakarot, expensive stones. Yakar really means, the term yakar means something which is rare, something which is uncommon. So we're talking about large stones, which makes them expensive. leyased habayit avnei gazit, to establish the house with unhewn stone. Okay? ויפסלו בוני שלמה ובני חירום והגבלים. So the constructor workers of Solomon and of Hiram chiseled, and the givlim. Givlim is a very, very good question, but givlim probably means people who do cutting of some sort. It says, "Vayechinu ha'etzim va'avanim v'not habayit," and they prepared the wood and the stone to build the house. Now, this is a really interesting thing. In one place, they want to establish the house on unhewn stones, and then we have a description here of these people are chiseling away at these things. So here's probably why we have these two different descriptions, maybe. And there is a question about was the house actually built with unhewn stone, because in some places it sounds like as if it was. But if we say avnei gazit, okay, unhewn stones to the establishment of the house, to basically build the foundation, it's actually not surprising, because we know as a fact that when you go into deeper levels of construction in different places, like for example the Western Wall, the stones become less pretty. So the upper stones, the ones you see with your eyes, are all very nice. They're smooth. They have this. They have that. Even though the style of stones from what we see from for example the Western Wall and what was used by King Solomon are very, very different. They were different styles. The Phoenician style had a very large bulge in the front. The rocks were very bulgy. You didn't have that very flat with a very thin, smooth rim. It was actually a very bulgy stone that was chiseled to fit, but the bulge was kept. And what's possible that we have here is that we have a description of what was used for the foundation. There we don't need anything pretty. Don't do extra work when not necessary. And then what was built on top that you actually saw with your eyes had to be built from something a bit cleaner and smoother. However, you can argue that the cutting here is only for the wood and not for the stone. So then we go ahead and we have this really, really magnificent opening in chapter 6, and it says very unusual opening. As far as I know, there's no anything we could compare this opening to. It says, "Vahi v'shmonim shana v'arba shana letzet b'nei Israel me'eretz Mitzrayim," and it was in the year 480 to the exodus of the children of Israel from the land of Egypt. B'shana ha'revit, in the 4th year. This is the 4th year of King Solomon. B'chodesh Ziv, in a month known as Ziv. Ziv is a name probably taken from the Phoenicians. Hu achodesh hasheni, that is the second month. So it's very important, by the way, to point out that the Bible, in a few places, especially here with King Solomon, uses terminology of month names borrowed from Phoenicians, and this is why some of the argument that I see with people like, you shouldn't use the names that the rabbis use, or the rabbinic calendar uses because these are names which are pagan. Well, what can you do? You have it also in the Bible here, and it's used very easily. One thing that's very important is that these names were dropped by the time of the Second Temple. So this documentation has to date into the First Temple very, very clearly, because our scholars try to date these type of things really, really late. So it points out, Chodesh Ziv hu Chodesh Hashan, it's the second month. Okay? What we call Iyar today. Limloch Shlomo al Israel, when Solomon became king over Israel, Vayiven habayit la'Adonai, he built the house of the Lord. I will point out, by the way, that there is a variant of the text in the Septuagint which is not 480 but 440, and there are some texts that give us different numbers for a lot of the stuff that we see here. But in any case, this is a really, really unusual opening, but it links we go back to the whole idea of the ideology here. It links the story of the Exodus to the building of the temple, where the temple is the pinnacle of everything. And then we actually have a detailed description of at least part of the house. It says, "V'abayit asher bana hamelech Shlomo la'Adonai," in the house which Solomon built to the Lord. "Shishim ama orko," it's 60 cubits long. "V'esrim rochbo," and 20 wide. "V'shloshim ama komato," and 30 cubits high. This is probably the interior of the house. And we get the exterior later on. There's a bit of a debate. Is this the interior or the exterior? Was the house like really small, or is this only the spaces inside? That we have 60 cubits length, So there's 20 for the holy, 40 for for 20 for the Holy of Holies, 30 or something like that for the holy, and then 10 for the entrance hall. And it says 20 cubits wide, so it's the width of everything, and every chamber is 20, and 30 cubits high. You have an interior, it's 30 cubits high from the inside. Some people say, no, this is from the outside, which means everything inside was a lot smaller. It says, V'ha'ulam al pnei ha'echal habayit, and the ulam, which is an entrance hall, on the front of the great house, hechal habayit, the greatness of hechal habayit is a bit redundant because hechal means great house and bayit means house. So there's a bit of a redundancy here. So it might be the word should be just ha'hechal. Esrim ama orko. Okay, so maybe if we read it differently, there's 20 for the Holy of Holies, 40 for the holy, and then we have an extra piece here for the entrance hall. So that's probably the more accurate way of reading this. So it is Esrim ama orko, it's 20 cubits long, al pnei rochav habayit, on the entire length of the front of the house. Okay, and then you have, it says, al pnei rochav habayit, and then it says, Eser ba'ama rochbo al pnei habayit, and 10 cubits is its width. Let's read this again. Sorry, it's 20 cubits long and 10 cubits wide in front of the house. That's what it's saying here. It says, Vayas labayit chalonei shkufim atumim. There's a bit of a debate what this means. He made something with the windows. Some people think it means the windows had some kind of frame around them. Some people think they had a weird shape to them. Some people think maybe there was some kind of a glass. Shkufim atumim, we're not 100% sure what this means. It says, Vayiven al kir habayit yatzia. So he built on the wall of the house a yatzia. Yatzia is some kind of porch all around. Saviv et kirot habayit, saviv la'echal ve'ladvir. Around, so he built this porch all around the walls to the great house in the dvir. The dvir is the inner room. Vayas tzlaot saviv, and he made some kind of maybe shelving or something, like things that stick out, and beams that hold this whole thing up together. And these are like little chambers in between. But there's a bit of an interesting thing here. It says, so it's in reverse. It's a reverse pyramid. It says, Hayatzia tachtona chamesh ba'ama rochba. The bottom porch is 5 cubits wide. Okay. Vatichona shesh ba'ama rochba, and the middle one is 6 cubits wide. Vashlishit, the top one, sheva ba'ama rochba, it's 7 cubits wide. This is a very strange idea. It's a reverse pyramid. Basically, to us, that will be upside down. Ki migraot natan labayit saviv chutza, for he made something. We don't know what migraot are. So some people think that migraot might have been like holes. This is what the architect, for example, said. The architect was sitting in the class. Maybe holes we put the beams in, but that might be a bit of trickery because the language today uses that for that. Maybe migraot is actually the opposite. That you have to think that if you have like stairs, and this is a reverse pyramid, it has a counterpart on the other side where you place whatever access you have from the top, from the next one above you, it holds it up. Okay, so you might have to think about the idea like a Lego, where you're taking something that has we'll call it a female side, and you place it onto a male side that's supposed to catch whatever access you have. Maybe, we don't know. This is all conjecture. Okay, and it says, so he places these migraot, we don't know what they are. Levilti achos b'kirot habayit. It doesn't hold on the walls of the house. Again, if we don't know what the migraot are, we can't really explain what exactly this verse means. It says, V'habayit b'ibanoto, the house when it's built, even shlema masa nivna. So the house itself is built from whole stone, whole carried stone, which means stones as they are naturally. Umakavot v'agerzen kol kli varzel lo nishar b'bayit b'ibanoto. And the axe and all the all the metal tools or iron tools were not heard in the house when it was built. So I actually once heard someone say, look, when they were building this, they were taking this and they were chiseling it outside, and then when they brought it in, they just put in the stones as they are. Sorry, the stones when they're already hewn, but they're actually hewn outside and then brought in to the temple, into the construction site as they are, instead of having people sitting there chiseling away inside the temple. Now, there's a quite interesting possibility that this is not what it's saying. Actually, no, they actually took whole stones as they are and put them, and they built the house with unhewn stone as well. It's a possibility as well. But the reason no actual labor of chiseling away at stone was done inside is also because the place was already a functioning temple. There was already an altar there. So, or maybe there was already an altar there. The tabernacle sat somewhere. So it's quite possible, or the ark sat somewhere. So there was probably already an altar there. This was already a functioning temple even before King Solomon built the house, which means that you can't just walk in and start working away and everything. You have to have people in a state of purity, and maybe even it was only very specific people were allowed to do the labor in the area itself. Like in the desert, only Levites were allowed to construct, or priests were involved and Levites were involved, so maybe Levites had to learn how to construct. By the way, in the second temple, they argued this was the fact that when repair work had to be done in the temple, it was usually priests and Levites that did the repair work, because there were only priests were allowed into the temple itself to do anything. Okay, then it says petach hatzela hatichona. So there's a tzela. There's like these rims somewhere. The middle one, el ketef habayit hayemanit. Okay, so there's the entrance to these structures that we just described in verse 6. Al katef habayit hayemanit, on the right hand side of the temple, which raises the question: are we talking about when you're looking at it, or when you are standing as if in the position of it? Okay. But there's an entrance there, and it says uvelulim ya'alu el hatichona, and with I would say these are spiral stairs. With spiral stairs you go up. Now sometimes people translate the word lul as this is an opening, but some people understand there's a spiral stairs that you go from one section to the other. So you go from the bottom one to the middle one with these spiral stairs, umin hatichona el shelishim, and from the middle to the third. It says, Vayiven et habayit vayichalehu, and he built the house and he finished it, vayisper et habayit gevim, and he covered the interior of the house with something that he calls gevim, which is not very clear, but this part said, ushderot ba'arazim, and something to do with a line of cedar. So it probably means that there's wood covering all the interior of the house. It says, Vayiven et hayatzia al kol habayit, and he built this wooden structure from the outside, al kol habayit, on all the house, 5 amot komato, 5 cubits at its height. Now that's a bit strange, because if that's 5 cubits, then this is not a very, very big thing. So why would, if it's only 5 cubits, we're talking about something that's just a bit over the height of a human being. So I think that what it means is that each one of these chambers was 5 cubits high. Vayechoz habayit ba'atzei harazim, and he strengthened the house with cedar wood. So it's quite possible that there was cedar wood holding up the house. It's quite possible that this wooden construction on the outside was part of how the house was actually being held up. So we get a basic description of parts of the house. There's a lot that's actually unknown of what exactly is going on here, but we have to live with what we have. And then we have an interjection here that's usually referred to as a Deuteronomistic interjection. That means that there's like a message, a morality clause which appears with the temple, and it says, "Vayidvar Adonai Shlomo lemon." The Lord said to Solomon, saying, this is verse 11, "Habayit hazeh asher ata boneh," this house which you are building, "Im telech bechokotai v'et mishpatai ta'aseh," if you walk in my covenants, in my laws, and my rulings you will do, "V'shamartai et kol mitzvotai," and you will keep all my commandments, "Lalechet b'hem," to walk by them, "V'akimoti et devari itach," I will uphold the words which I spoke with you, which devari itach, my word with you, asher dibarti el David avicha, which I spoke to David your father. And he says, "V'shachanti betoch bnei Israel," and I will dwell in the midst of the children of Israel. And v'shachanti relates to the term mishkan, which is the subject of the reading itself that we have in the Torah. It says, "V'lo ezav et ami Yisrael," and I will not abandon my people Israel. So this is a very, very important point where it says, listen, you can build a house as much as you like. If the intent of the people is not correct and people are doing whatever they want, then this house means absolutely nothing. Because at the end of the day, the whole idea of doing all these things is about loyalty to God, is about keeping God's law, not just doing because you're trying to show that you're righteous before your God. This is very different than what we find in the ancient Near East, where kings just did things to try to appease the gods, but there was not always real loyalty there. In our case specifically, the building of the temple comes with a clause that it doesn't help me that it's not going to work for you if you're just going to build a structure and say, look, I did. No, your heart has to be in the right place. I hope you enjoyed this recording. Please remember to share with your family and friends. And as always, if you have been blessed by these recordings, please consider helping with the research that's put into making these recordings. But more importantly, share, comment, think about the ideas, research by yourself as well. There's lots of material out there that you can use. And if there are any architects that have a better idea of what this exactly looks like, I would be more than happy to hear what you have to describe about these things. Kol tov.